We're supposed to be here, four of us, but our friend couldn't make it, Janek Simon. However, he's a visual artist. He contributed to our intervention in two ways. He designed a star as a sort of symbol. We'll talk about it later. You will see it on the screen. Could we please start? Thank you. And also he prepared a sort of video work that is based on the very well-known sign of solidarity. We'll present it later on during our speech.
What we want to present today is a part, or perhaps a moment, of an ongoing project of ours, which is an attempt to work through the archives of Polish solidarity. So, the 2009 London Conference on the Idea of Communism showed in an inspiring way how the idea of communism can function and be given meaning. However, an important issue that was not as deeply discussed as it is worth it was the actual historical experience of really existing communist states. The papers presented and discussions held gave no clear conclusion whether we should approach this issue in a Kantian way and treat communism as a sort of regulatory ideal, independent of any historical reality, or rather adopt a Hegelian perspective that judges an idea according to its realization in the real world, in actual history. Or, to put it differently, should we look at the communism and the communist hypothesis in a Platonian way, where idea is considered something completely transcendent from its earthly representations, or more Aristotelian one, where ideas exist only in particular objects. During the last 2 days, this issue has also been addressed in an insufficient way, as we think. As we ourselves lived in the ex-Soviet bloc, coming to terms with the historical experience of the really existing communism is for us an issue of utmost importance, for two reasons. Primarily, in order to decide what content the communist idea can have and how it should be related to an attempt of its actual realization by the Bolsheviks and their successors. Secondly, for a sort of PR reasons. For us, living in an ex-communist state, to support the communist hypothesis is even more difficult and demands even more determination than for somebody coming from the Western world or another place that had no experience with a regime calling itself communist. Any radical critique of capitalism articulated in post-communist reality has to face on a daily basis an argument that seems conclusive for many people. We know the alternative, we even lived it. It doesn't work and it inevitably ends in gulags. One of the most vital issues to deal with for the contemporary anti-capitalist movements in such countries as Poland is the heritage of so-called really existing socialism or communism. We can't accept its heritage, but we also can't pretend that it has nothing to do with ideas we believe in and that its failure is not our problem. So in our contribution to the current conference, we would like to address quite a historical and practical issue and refer somehow to the historical experience of the so-called communist regime.
However, we do not intend to mount any frontal campaign of demascations and accusations. The question how communist was communism has been raised and answered many times. There has been three most notable attempts to sort out this issue. First, Trotskyists, calling Soviet communism state capitalism, and showing that as a result of the Stalinist perversion, quote, the state party machine has become the sole owner of the means of production, which means the sole capitalist, and it had acted accordingly ever since. Tony Cliff's State Capitalism in Russia, published in 1955, elaborates quite well upon this thesis. The second approach to the Soviet question is the one adopted by Guy Debord, who described Soviet and Chinese communism as just another form of spectacle, the concentrated one as opposed to the dispersed spectacle of capitalism. According to Debord, Leninist proletarian parties turned itself into sole owners of a system of state capitalism. Governing form of a spectacle, the so-called concentrated spectacularity, specific for a communist state. In the early 80s, Debord prophesied the merge of these two forms and creation of a unified spectacle that actually came true in the 90s and goes today under the name of neoliberal globalization. The third attempt was undertaken by Immanuel Wallerstein, According to him, Eastern Bloc countries had never actually had a chance to establish a communist mode of production. In his perspective, only world systems can have modes of production, not individual states, or even blocks of states. In a framework of world system theory, Soviet bloc was an integral, semi-peripheral part of global capitalism. Its place in global division of labor was determined not by itself, but by the capitalist core. Communist states were therefore never able to break away, even if their political elites intended to, from capitalist logic of infinite accumulation, nor from structures of economic rationality attached to it. In this perspective, the communist experiment in Eastern Europe was nothing but an enterprise of collective mercantilist economic policy aimed at creation of developmentalist project for a traditionally backward region of a global capitalist world system. We do not want to engage in neither polemics nor affirmations of these approaches, though we are well aware of their respective contributions to critical theory and emancipatory projects, as well as their mistakes and misjudgments. We rather intend to look ori and to confront the issue from the flank. We believe that a sort of communist project was on the way towards realization, or, to be more precise, that the communist hypothesis, as Alain Badiou understands it, a possibility of another possibility, was indeed articulated within the Soviet bloc. It was a radically new possibility, not just a small rearrangement of historical decorations. It opened a whole new space of subsequent possibilities. So, as we'll try to prove later on, it can be rightly called an event in the strong philosophical sense. It took place in August 1980 and led to the emergence of a political subject, operating until 13th December 1981. Its name was Solidarity. Of course, I guess you're all familiar with the logo of Solidarity. However, this sign has become a concentration of interpretations, connotations, and meanings that are very difficult to carry on if we want to engage in any sort of emancipatory project. So another contribution by our friend Janek Simon is an attempt to get rid of this accumulated meanings that we don't like, and to come to reach solidarity at its primal meaning. So his work was to ask several dozen people just to write down the word solidarity on a piece of paper, the way they think it should be written. And we'll show a video that is a combination of these realizations. It will go in the background.
For those who are used to mainstream liberal interpretation of modern history, this point of view about solidarity may seem strange or even absurd. How come? Wasn't solidarity the actual grave digger for communism in this part of the world? Actually, the weak version of history paints this kind of picture. The communist governments were overthrown by a popular movement acting for a long time, at least since Prague 68, in favor of liberal democracy combined with market reforms, enforcing capitalist transformation, as well as human rights upon corrupt communist dictatorships. Without an attempt to give a general explanation of the regime change in the entire Eastern Bloc, we can say that without the slightest doubt, it was not the case in Poland. The Solidarity was not a pro-market and pro-capitalist movement, and establishing an absolute rule of capital definitely was not its original intent. It cannot be reduced to a dissident movement fighting for liberal democracy and for liberal freedoms, nor for so-called socialism with human face. In order to understand the historic development that led from the huge social movement of the early 80s to the radical neoliberal transformation at the end of the decade, we have to introduce some important conceptual distinctions. They could take various forms. However, we think it is worth to use the terms taken from the philosophy of Alain Badiou and talk about the event and its consequences. This led us to delimiting 6 different stages in the development of solidarity. The actual event of August 1980, when an independent workers' organization was recognized by the party-state machine, the political subject that emerged as a result, so-called First Solidarity between August 1980 and December 1981, the martial law introduced in winter 1981, the so-called Second Solidarity reactivated after the martial law, the neoliberal transformation between 1989 and 1993, and liberal reinterpretation of the myth of solidarity happening ever since. We'd like to focus on the original event and the subject it produced, the First Solidarity, and to show that recognizing it as an articulation of the communist hypothesis is a factual description of what took place between August 1980 and December 1981. What's more, we believe that this is precisely because it was an articulation of the communist hypothesis and not just a pro-market, pro-liberal movement. It got so brutally repressed by the state communist regime and so radically reinterpreted later on in order to castrate its dangerous emancipatory potential. We would go as far as to claim that Poland was in the early 80s on a way towards a revolution that, if fulfilled, would dramatically reshape the power relations and ideological landscape of the Western world. It's too much to say that it would abolish the global rule of capital, but it would not allow neoliberalism to triumph so ruthlessly in the 90s and Francis Fukuyama to proclaim the end of history, which is still a lot. We have to remember that what an event opens up is a space of possibilities and not necessities. Event's consequences depend solely on our fidelity to this event. This is the reason we believe that it is worth going back to this misinterpreted event of the early 80s and to look for the ways of, to put it metaphorically, defreezing its emancipatory potential. In order to do it, we would have to take it out of two subsequent freezers it was put into, the martial law and the liberal interpretation.
We'll try to visualize this two freezers. Another Polish artist, Agnieszka Kuran, made a quite... yeah, but I don't switch it on. Yeah, okay. Another Polish artist, Agnieszka Kurant, made a piece that is quite complicated, but we'll show just a part of it. The picture that you can see here is a famous picture taken by Niedenthal on the day the martial law was introduced in December 81. You can see a Cinema Moskva playing the film Apocalypse Now, Czas Apokalipsy. With the tanks in front of the cinema, it looked quite dramatic. This cinema was brought down in the early 90s, and Cineplex was constructed there. This is the second freezer that Solidarity was put in. This is exactly the same place where the other picture was taken. Agnieszka Kurant tried to encourage the owner of the cinema to put the banner Apocalypse Now, you can see it here. However, they did not agree, so she made a sort of a Photoshop manipulation, and she put the Apocalypse Now poster on front of this cinema. This is the second freezer. This is the neoliberal transformation of the early 90s.
Okay, so it's either Russian tanks or American ogres. Before we attempt to develop a communist interpretation of solidarity, let us give a brief and general sketch of the first solidarity. We'll deliberately try to expose its repressed aspects and features that disappeared from the established liberal interpretation. To start with simple statistics and formal characteristics. Solidarity, during its short existence, reached the number of 10 million members, constituting 25% of the entire population of Poland. It makes it one of the largest formalized organizations in the European history. NSDAP at its peak reached only 8.5 million members. Among its contemporaries, Solidarity could easily rival the Soviet Communist Party that had 11 million members, not talking about the Polish one with not even half of this number. Of course, we are still far from the Communist Party of China, claiming 72 million members. However, this number does not even amount to 10% of the Chinese population. Solidarity originated as a trade union, and formally it has remained one until today, though from the early 90s it has practically functioned as a political party. What's more, it was originally an industrial workers' union. What cannot but sound as an ironic twist of history, its founders were mostly part of the first generation brought up in the communist Poland. One is even tempted to say that Solidarity was the greatest success of Polish state communism. It would have not been possible if workers had not been taught and frequently reminded about the importance and historical agency of the working class. In an unprecedented act of over-orthodoxy, Solidarity took official communist ideology at its word, what turned properly unbearable for the state communism and finally led it to the violent passage à l'acte of the martial law. Perhaps then we could discern here an intriguing dialectics. The introduction of state communism in Poland in 1944 was, more than anything else, an act of geopolitical engineering, retroactively hailed as an event under the name of July Manifesto and annually celebrated. This false, simulacric event, in the long run, prepared the ground and created conditions for a true event. Or, put another way, one could also see here an example of the logics, of the Leninist logics discussed by Slavoj Žižek in The Revolution at the Gates, that the revolution has to strike twice. Solidarity developed gradually, building upon several confrontations between workers and state communist regime. In 1956 in Poznań, in 1970 in Gdańsk, and in 1976 in Ursus, near Warsaw, to mention just the most important ones. This fact was stressed by official declarations of the Union, like the Solidarity's program formulated in October 1981, as well as by commentators and analysts. American historian Lawrence Goodwin, in his book Breaking the Barrier, The Rise of Solidarity in Poland, shows how workers developed and perfected their organizational skills throughout 3 decades of protest. In summer 1980, the Interfactory Strike Committee unified 522 industrial plants in northern Poland in a very well-designed network of communication and coordinated action. However, during just a year after its legal registration in 1980, Solidarity lost its purely workers' and industrial identity, becoming the movement of the proletariat in Marxist sense, the exploited and deprived of control and ownership of means of production. Its base could not be narrowed anymore to any social category, which is a fact of the utmost political significance, as we'll try to show later. Solidarity united people of almost every possible social identity: industrial workers, intellectuals, teachers, students, taxi drivers, miners, writers, journalists, etc. What's more, in a very clever political move, it denied to organize itself like most trade unions, according to industry branch and occupational status. It rather chose to use geographical criteria and formed itself into regions. By this smart move, it did not allow the state to manipulate one branch against another and to destroy the union's unity, by, for instance, giving a pay rise to miners in order to alienate them from university teachers. The union was organized in a democratic manner, trying to give each and every member the biggest possible control over the union's policy and actions. Big stress was put on internal and external transparency. For example, during the negotiations with the government at the times of the strikes in Gdańsk shipyard in August 1980, all talks between Solidarity and government representatives were broadcast in the entire plant through intercoms. It's an interesting fact that one of the first suggestions made by the Warsaw intellectuals when they joined the workers in the shipyard to take part in the talks was to make them secret. This idea was put forward by Tadeusz Mazowiecki, future politician and first prime minister of post-communist government who introduced neoliberal reforms in Poland in 1989 and 1990.
What is as interesting as the form of the Solidarity movement is its content. In the reconstruction of its main features, we will rely on the above-mentioned program of solidarity formulated in October '81. That is the fullest expression of the Union's ideals and goals. This program can be justly called a document of a political subjectivity emerging as a result of the original event. Radicalism and complexity of Solidarity's political vision, combined with the experience of general strike that put the entire country on stop in March the same year, was probably the decisive reason why the party decided to introduce the martial law in December '81, in order to deal with solidarity in one swift and efficient stroke. Let's start with the myth of pro-capitalist and pro-liberal character of solidarity. Even a brief look at the program falsifies this claim. In this 60 pages long document, one doesn't find even a single appearance of the word capitalism. And it was not just a smart rhetoric maneuver designed to fool the censors. There is no other word or term where capitalism appears in disguise. There are few mentions of market, but never accompanied by the adjective free. However, in each and every place, the market is described as a supplementary mechanism intended to work within the frame of a disalienated and socially controlled economy. The same applies to another holy cow of neoliberal capitalist rhetoric, private property and privatization. On the 60 pages, on these 60 pages, the word private, or any of its derivatives, appears only 4 times, and only 2 of them actually refer to private companies. There is absolutely no mention of any sort of privatization of state and public property. Actually, the program explicitly and consistently demands the contrary. The term used in the document more often than any other, we counted 144 uses, is social, in all possible forms and combinations. Social justice, social welfare, social protest, social movement, social rebirth, social initiative, social costs of economic reforms, and the most important ones, because referring to the question of political economy, social enterprise, social control over economy, and a demand communist par excellence, social ownership of means of production. This point is of utmost importance. Solidarity goes even further in a very symptomatic way. It addresses the Communist Party with a demand of real socialization of control over economy. It's a very Lacanian moment when the party gets its own message in a reversed form. The second most important and most often evoked issue in the text of the program is self-government. It appears 44 times, so almost on every page. However, it's not only a demand for a local self-government that can become easily pacified as a part of liberal civil society. What is at stake is self-government for the workers in the workplace, with a power to control the productive process. The document gives the example of the so-called net, a group of industrial plants controlled and run by the workers' committees, as a model for practical organization of the production process. This issue is presented in the program of solidarity from 3 sides. A pragmatic one. The workers are those who know the best how to organize and run their factories. The political economic one. The collective control over the production process is the correct form of social organization of economy. And also a Hegelian one, referring to the dignity of work and worker not respected by the communist regime. What is also very important is the bricolage character of the program. It consists of universal statements and postulates, as well as utterly concrete and down-to-earth demands and solutions. It is articulated in languages, notions, and symbols which at that particular historical moment were available for its authors, cutting across official and ideological opposition, drawing simultaneously from Hegel, Marx, and Christian social teaching. Therefore, one should not be surprised seeing both Workers of the Word Unite banner and the picture of Saint Mary hang side by side at the gate of the Gdańsk shipyard. But, as we believe, this particular articulation does not exhaust its universal residue. So, to make a general summary of Solidarity's program, it does not go in the direction of liberal capitalism, does not put private property above any form of ownership. Its basic attitude can be rightly called emancipatory. It strives for desalienation of power, including the right of the collective will to control economic process, and social control over means of production, which cannot be brought down to any liberal vision that deliberately and consistently puts economy beyond any collective control on the level of both workplace and general society. The social control over means of production is defined as an ability to control the workplace as well as to maintain social control of the 5-year plans. The idea of planned economy remains unchallenged, which clearly shows the references to the market appearing in the Solidarities program cannot be interpreted in the spirit of chaotic capitalist free market, functioning as a locus of actual control over economy. It also proves that the Solidarities program cannot be reduced to anarcho-syndicalism. We can say that the program of economic policy articulated by Solidarity was based on 3 basic principles: self-government of the workers, the most important of them, elements of central planning, and market exchange, but seen not as a source of capital accumulation, but as means of securing a fair distribution of different goods. It is absolutely clear that the framework, that the program was challenging the existing political system and that it was not able to fit into its framework.
An important step marking the birth of solidarity as a political subject is a message to the workers of Eastern Europe, articulated at the first convention of Solidarity on September 8, 1981. Solidarity, over the heads of both Polish and other Eastern European states, spoke directly to the working men and women of Eastern Europe, supporting them in their struggle for free, independent trade unions. Solidarity picked at that point case of the other, as Jacques Rancière would put it, ignoring raison d'etat of People's Republic of Poland and its alliances, establishing itself as a free voice of Polish working people, speaking directly to its neighbors in Czechoslovakia, USSR, etc., and recognizing their case as its own. In the dominant liberal interpretations of the event of Solidarity, all demands for greater workers' democracy are interpreted, if they are acknowledged at all, as nothing but a meaningless tribute to the dominant language and ideology of that period. Tribute which Solidarity, Movement for Political Freedom and Anti-Communist Opposition, had to pay in order to be able to fight for its true political aims, liberal democratic capitalism, etc. We believe that these interpretations are purely ideological and completely ignoring a long history of struggle of Polish workers for a self-government in their workplace, which took place in Poland since the end of the Second World War against, which is very important, of the communist states and its bureaucracy. Right after the end of the Second World War, Polish workers spontaneously started to organize themselves into workers' councils, which were taking control over their workplaces like factories, large land estates, and others. This movement, from the beginning, was treated by the Polish Stalinist Party, PPR, with great suspicion. As soon as Stalinist bureaucracy established itself firmly in Poland, it crushed any genuine self-government of the workers. After the events of October 1956, which started the processes of de-Stalinization of Poland, the promises of workers' self-government was one of the most important reasons of popularity of the new leader of Polish Communist Party, Władysław Gomułka. He failed to keep the promise. State communist power created some institutions, like factory councils, simulating workplace democracy, but they were not able to satisfy demands of the workers. The other dominant, in the contemporary ideological landscape in Poland, interpretation of Solidarity, the conservative one, portrays it as a movement of purely moral resistance against the totalitarian or authoritarian practices of communist state in the name of ethical ideals stemming from Christian, especially Catholic sources. According to Polish conservative sociologist Jadwiga Staniszkis, the Solidarity originated from naturally Thomist sentiment of Polish people, which had to collide with the instrumental rationality of post-Stalinist state. In this perspective, Solidarity was first and foremost a completely apolitical articulation of moral autonomy and personal dignity, understood in Catholic personalist terms, against the demands of authoritarian state's political machine. Conservative intellectuals emphasize also the role of the visit of Pope John Paul II in Poland in 1979 as the spark which started the events of August 1980. We disagree with that interpretations, which completely fail to grasp the political dimension of the movement of solidarity. We can't deny the vital role of both ethical and religious component in the solidarity movement, but we would like to argue that in the case of solidarity, we can see how a purely ethical resistance is transforming itself into a political movement. Catholic religion definitely and undoubtedly provided members of solidarity important symbols and images which they were able to gather themselves, both symbolically and physically. But we shouldn't forget that from the beginning solidarity was a movement which wasn't and couldn't be controlled by Roman Catholic Church. Solidarity was using the religious language in order to articulate political demands and hope of transformation of social and political reality. Those hopes definitely didn't have anything to do with Thomism. If anything, religious language of solidarity was rather bursting with strong messianic passion, messianic promises of freedom as foreign to Thomism as it is possible. The references to religious language and symbols were very much a contingent result of a directly present, so easily accessible set of terms and concepts. So a post-secular interpretation of their meaning and content would be quite accurate. One can clearly see from the historical documents that solidarity expressed itself also using, for example, quotes from Bertolt Brecht, that just grabbed whatever tools they had to transmit their message.
This is a poster from 1980, what we are waiting for, the big quote says, and it's expressed by a quotation from Bertolt Brecht. So it's an example of a combination of a bricolage of various forms of available language terms and symbols.
It might be also tempting. Does it work? It might be also tempting to put the movement of solidarity in the theoretical framework of populism, as outlined by Ernesto Laclau in his Unpopulist Reason. Laclau himself refers to solidarity 4 times in his book. Definitely, political situation in Poland in the beginning of the 80s created conditions favorable to the emergence of populist political subject. The communist power was completely alienated and separated from the society. Due to a failure of technocratic project of Edward Gierek's administrations in the 70s, caused by entrance of world economy into B phase of its post-war contractive wave, many economic and social demands couldn't be satisfied by the existing political and economic system. We can look at the movement of solidarity as a populist political subject, gathering different demands and transforming them into a chain of equivalences. Definitely, solidarity was able to bind different demands, representing interests of different social groups, and create collective body of the people, situated in a clear opposition to the power, bound by that chain into the new political subjectivity body, which did not exist prior to the process of binding these different demands. The case of solidarity shows how the process of representation, the emergence of social movement, is retroactively creating the body of the political people it represents. We can even admit that the name of solidarity after August 1980 became that what Laclau calls an empty signifier. Both solidarity as a name and the most important political demand associated with it, demand for free, independent, self-governing trade unions, started to represent all other demands articulated by the people to the power to represent the frontier of what is possible to achieve in the given political conditions. However, we see a problem stemming from such populist interpretation of solidarity. We believe that the movement of the first solidarity was able to transcend the logic of Laclaian populism. Solidarity even if at the beginning was articulating political conflict in opposition to the alienated power separated from society, the people, with time ceased to define itself as simple opposition to the power. Following the movement, which can also be found in the history of Paris Commune, Solidarity was able to move from opposition to the power to establishing itself as power, from contestation of existing political order to establishing a new one, identical with Solidarity